No, Nirvana was not a pioneer of grunge. Here are the true pioneers. The real kickstarters of the subgenre that is basically a blend of punk, hard rock, and metal. We need to go all the way back to the early 1980s to highlight some of the bands that started doing things a little differently in the Pacific Northwest. One of the first was Malfunkshun, formed by the charismatic Andrew Wood at the age of 14, with his brother Kevin. They probably had the most distinct aesthetic out of all of the PNW bands, with Wood having a larger-than-life persona, often performing in face paint and adopting an alter ego. Landrew the Love Child. But beneath the theatrics, the music was gritty, heavy, and deeply influential. While Malfunkshun never achieved mainstream success, their fusion of rock excess and punk energy led to a darker, more stripped-down sound of grunge. After the band dissolved, Wood formed Mother Love Bone, which laid the foundation for Pearl Jam after his tragic death in 1990. Now, if you really want to understand where grunge came from, you can't skip over the U-Men. Formed in 1981, these guys weren't just making music. They were creating chaos. They weren't radio friendly, they weren't polished, and they sure as hell weren't trying to be. Their sound? Raw, jagged, unpredictable. The complete opposite of the shiny, overproduced rock dominating the early 80s. Back then, MTV was pumping out glam metal bands with teased hair and spandex, but the U-Men? They were playing distorted, swampy, punk-infused noise that sounded like it crawled out of a Seattle gutter. Their wild, reckless live shows became legendary. One time, they even set a lake on fire during a performance in Green River, Wyoming, by pouring gasoline into the lake. Yeah, these guys didn't just play music, they set the scene on fire, literally. The U-Men were also the first band to work with manager Susan Silver, who later managed Soundgarden, Screaming Trees, Alice in Chains, and more. 2 years later, Melvins reshaped heavy music in a way no one expected. While rock radio was filled with big hair, catchy choruses, and flashy guitar solos, the Melvins did the opposite, slowing things down, stripping away the polish, and making it loud, raw, and heavy. Tracks like Hooch and Night Goat featured punishing riffs and intense sludginess that played a key role in shaping grunge's sound. Initially a fast-paced post-punk band, Osbourne eventually drew from his punk and bluesy hard rock influences to create something new. I heard a sound in my head that was different from what I'd heard before. A lot of it was slower, but I wanted to do it in a more metal way, sort of, but I didn't want all the heavy metal trappings. I wanted a hybrid of the whole thing, he said. Unlike Melvins, this channel is not slowing things down. Hit subscribe, and I'll promise you we will ramp things up. When Bam Bam hit the Seattle music scene, they didn't sound like anything else. Formed in 1983, they were playing gritty, raw, distorted rock before anyone was calling it grunge. And here's something that not enough people talk about. Tina Bell, their frontwoman, was a black woman fronting an aggressive punk metal hybrid band in Seattle. That alone makes them stand out in a scene that was overwhelmingly white and male. At a time when hair metal was suffocating the airwaves, Bam Bam was laying the groundwork for the loud, unfiltered rebellion that would later define grunge. Tracks like Ground Zero and Villains Also Wear White had that dark, unpolished energy that would soon become the signature Seattle sound. Soundgarden and Pearl Jam drummer Matt Cameron, who played drums with the group for a time, often names Bam Bam as one of the original grunge bands during interviews and praises Bell for her talent as a singer. Picture this. Seattle, 1984. While mainstream rock was all about glitz and glam, a band called Green River was busy ripping it all apart. This was the first true grunge band, fusing punk's sneering attitude with the heavy, dirty riffs that would define the genre. Green River didn't just influence grunge, they invented it. Tracks like Swallow My Pride, Come On Down, and This Town had that unmistakable rawness, heavy, slightly unhinged, and completely different from the slick, polished rock of the time. The band's lineup was legendary. Mark Arm, who later formed Mudhoney, Stone Gossard, and Jeff Ament, who would go on to form Pearl Jam. Their split in 1987 was a turning point. One side wanted to go heavier, Mudhoney. The other wanted to go more melodic, Pearl Jam. But no matter where they ended up, Green River had already set the blueprint for grunge. Of the most successful Seattle bands, Soundgarden were formed the earliest, so it's fair to call them pioneers of the scene. Chris Cornell, Hiro Yamamoto, and Kim Thale formed a trio in 1984 which featured Cornell singing and playing the drums. They eventually recruited Scott Sundquist on drums and later, of course, the thunderous Matt Cameron, so that Cornell could focus solely on singing. Tracks like Hunted Down and Nothing to Say from their early days already had that dark, brooding intensity. But when Flower hit in 1988, people started to realize this was something different. Soundgarden's sound was unique for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, most of their songs were written in odd time signatures. Secondly, Thale started playing guitar in drop D tuning after it was introduced to him by Buzz Osborne of Melvins. Last but not least, Cornell had one of the most powerful voices on the scene. By 1985, Seattle's underground was starting to bubble up, but it needed someone to tie the sound together, a band that would experiment, take risks, and unknowingly shape what was coming. Well, that was Skinyard. Though they didn't achieve the success that many of the other bands had, they did contribute to the Deep Six compilation album, which showcased various Seattle bands such as Soundgarden, Melvins, and Malfunkshun. But here's the thing, Skinyard made killer music too. Tracks like Reptile, Burn a Hole, and Scratch had that dark, heavy, distorted energy that would later define the scene. I guess timing is everything, because right as grunge exploded in 1992, Skinyard called it quits. The bands that the members eventually joined all became bigger on their own. Their guitarist, Jack Endino, ended up producing some of the most important grunge records ever. Nirvana, Mudhoney, Soundgarden, you name it. I guess if there was ever a grunge band with one foot in another era, it was Screaming Trees. Formed in 1985, they weren't just another Seattle sludge fest. They had a psychedelic edge that made them stand out. While other bands were channeling punk and metal, Screaming Trees had this trippy, bluesy vibe mixed with that unmistakable grunge rawness. And then there's Mark Lanigan. What a voice. Deep, brooding, full of pain and soul. You hear it on tracks like Even If and Especially When, Bed of Roses, and later, the haunting Nearly Lost You. From the single soundtrack. They were from Ellensburg, which was outside of Seattle, but they were close enough to have just been in the right place at the right time. They achieved the most commercial success around 1992, after grunge had exploded and Seattle became the rock music epicenter of the US. Let's move on to TAD, one of the heaviest bands to come out of the Seattle scene. Formed in 1987 and led by Tad Doyle, they combined sludgy, down-tuned riffs with a raw, almost primal energy that set them apart. Unlike other grunge bands, TAD leaned more towards thick, heavy guitar tones and slow, crushing rhythms. While recording their debut album, God's Balls, Doyle recalled using unusual contraptions for sound effects, such as an empty gas tank from a car, a hacksaw, and a large brass tube that was used as a part from a microwave transmitter that a friend had given me in Boise. Tracks like Wood Goblins captured that unpolished, gritty sound that grunge became known for. Not aiming for radio hits or mainstream success, they just played loud, heavy music because that's what they loved. A controversial album cover got them dropped from their label, and as grunge exploded, they got lost in the shuffle. Let's wrap this up with Mudhoney, the band that gave grunge its sneer and sarcasm. Formed in 1988 by Mark Arm, these guys weren't just playing heavy, distorted rock. They were making fun of the whole rock scene while they did it. If other grunge bands took influence from metal, Mudhoney came straight out of garage rock and punk, keeping things loose, raw, and full of attitude. Their breakthrough came with Touch Me, I'm Sick, a song that was basically a middle finger to the overproduced glam rock dominating the late 80s. Sonic Youth became fans of the band and invited them to tour with them in the UK in 1989, which sparked a lot of interest in the media overseas. The international press coverage had a profound impact on how the rest of the world eventually began looking at Seattle and its many fledgling bands. So yeah, these bands were already making the amps scream, cranking up the distortion, and pissing off metalheads. It wasn't some late 80s phenomenon. This sound had been brewing since the early 80s, long before the world caught on. Like it or not, this is where grunge began.